Good morning, everyone. I'm Shauna Butts, and I'm with the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum, and welcome to our virtual lecture series. We will be recording today's lecture and uploading it to our YouTube channel. So if for any reason you can't stay or you have any technology issues, we will be sending out a link to the recording in the coming days. And as always, there will be time for questions at the end, so feel free to use the chat box at the bottom of the screen or the question and answer functions, and I will field them to Sarah at the end of her lecture. And if you want to support our lecture series, other programming we do, and our collections, I will post a link in a chat box where you can make a donation. Today's speaker is well known here at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum, and she really needs no introduction. In the spring, our very own managing director and curator, Sarah Kaufman, presented Opening the Curator's Treasure Chest, Exploring the War of 1812 collection. And it was so well received, and we have so many unique and wonderful items in this collection that she is back by popular demand for part 2. And if you missed the first part of her talk, it is on YouTube, and I will post a link as well in the chat box. Sarah has her master's in public history from Western, and she has been working in Niagara museums for over 10 years. And she has been in this current position here at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum since 2010. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing our War of 1812 collection with everyone today. We can never have everything out on display at one time, so it's wonderful to be able to bring some things out of the vault. So take it away.
Thank you, Shauna. So thank you everyone for joining today, and for those who will see this online later. As Shauna mentioned, a lot of people were really interested in the collection for part 1, and there were a number of things that I had to cut. So I'm moving through and bringing up some more stuff. I'm sure that there will be things that I know there's things that I've missed out for this time, but I'm not sure if it'll be enough that'll be exciting for a third lecture, but let's move our way through. So I just wanted to kind of say the same thing that I said at the beginning of the other one. When the Society first started collecting, a number of 1812 artifacts are actually from the very early collection of our organization. So it was a huge focus for the Society at that time. And if you can imagine, the Society started in 1895 and the centennial of the War of 1812 was happening in 1912. You can see why the Society had focused on collecting relevant artifacts that would help promote national identity. And at that time too, they were very much about tying closely with the British Empire. So you can see why they collected so much. So I'm going to start where I left off last time, if my slide will work. There we go. So last time I had kind of featured a couple of our belt plates from the collection. So, and there's a gorget here as well. So the gorget is the crescent shaped piece up at the top corner, the top left there. And it has the royal cipher there that you see, the GR and the crown at the top. It was worn around the neck below the collar and was held in place by a ribbon and rosettes. The gorget may be said to have been the last surviving piece of plate armor used in the British Army, with a few exceptions. And by 1684, the gorget was worn only by officers and had become a badge of rank worn only when on duty. Eventually, in 1830, they were abolished by the government as well. The little tiny crossbelt plate. Now the crossbelt plates are the rest of the items that you see on the screen there. And I showed an image, which is not ours, that I found online, just to show you what I meant about the cross of the belt. And you can see that guy, the soldier there, has a crossbelt plate on his one of his white belts across his chest. So that gives you an idea of where these items were placed on the soldier. So the first one that we have in our collection is the Newfoundland Regiment. And again, it has the GR cipher and it says Royal Newfoundland Regiment. So this regiment served in Niagara during the War of 1812, and they were present at the attack of Fort George in May of 1813. They were raised in 1803, and they also fought at other 1812 battles, Fort Erie, Frenchtown, York, Sackett's Harbor, etc. I'm not going to go into too much detail about those. What battles they were all in 1812, because there were many. The next one is the 49th Regiment. So it's a brass crossbelt plate in an oval shape with the 49th written there. And the 49th first came to Canada in 1803, and Major General Isaac Brock, who everyone knows, that was his regiment, and later on Roger Schaeff, and people know Brigadier General John Vincent as well. If you're studying War of 1812 history, you'll recognize that name. So in 1812, this regiment engaged in many battles, again, Frenchman's Creek, Salmon River, and Fort George, and Queenston Heights, and Beaver Dam, Black Rock, and Chrysler's Farm. So a number of local battles here. The next one we have there in the middle, it has a thistle motif. That's the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles that's there. And this is the 1st Battalion. That's why there's a first on the bottom. And the 1st Battalion did serve in the Niagara Peninsula during the War of 1812 as well. The de Watteville Regiment is the next one up, and this item is for a regiment of Swiss mercenaries in the British service, possibly led by Lieutenant Colonel Victor Fisher of de Watteville. The regiment was stationed in Upper Canada during the War of 1812 and helped with the defense of Fort Erie in August of 1814, which was later burned by the Americans. And the final crossbelt plate is the 41st Regiment. So again, it's stamped as 41st, and the 1st Battalion came to Canada from Ireland in 1800, and it again was at Fort George, Queenston, Stony Creek, Fort Niagara, Lundy's Lane, Fort Erie, and such. So a number of battles there. So that's just a selection of our crossbelt plates. The next item that we have is an actual soldier's water canteen. Now the image here is not from our collection, but it does show, you can see the gentleman has under his armpit there one of the water canteens. So it had slots on the sides and 2 holes with a wooden stopper, and is held together by metal bands, and the buff colored leather carrying strap is a reproduction that helps to illustrate how the canteen was carried, but the canteen itself is original. And the branding on it is the broad arrow over the Royal GR cipher, which signifies that it was Crown property. Therefore, it can be understood that this item was used by the British infantry during the war. The fact that it doesn't have a regiment on it was possibly because they were expecting to have them returned at some point, but they were issued from the commissariat stores, and like I said, not regimentally marked. We have a number of muskets. So I'm getting into some of the very military end of our collection, obviously, but we do have a number of muskets in our collection, including the Brown Bess, which with an India pattern design. This was a British regulation issue flintlock musket. And there's general engravings that are usually found on these muskets, the tower signifying the Tower of London, and the crown and the GR cipher, which we've mentioned from the previous items as well, marking, that it's British. And some muskets have other inscriptions, sometimes personal inscriptions on them. We also have one that is a marking for the 10th Royal Veteran Battalion, who fought in Canada between 1807 and 1815. And their force totaled about 600 men in Canada, and were made up of older soldiers, as you can imagine, because it's veterans battalions. So they were not totally fit for active duty, and so they were sometimes given sort of side jobs, but still served, of course. We also have a Charleville musket, which was used by many in the Upper Canadian Militia during the war. Some of this kind were previously used by French regulars and militia in Canada pre-1759 and were used in the American Revolution. So we do have one of those on display right now in our 1812 display. We also have a Baker rifle, which was also used. It was the first standardized production of a military rifle in Britain. So it's an infantry rifle that the British, the British military brought in. There's a series of rifles that were imported from the continent before that, but the British Army, through the Napoleonic Wars, which is overlaps with the War of 1812, of course, they brought in the Baker rifle. Now I showed here a few flintlock musket pistols here. So that's what you see. There's an engraving of a face there, and then the 2 pistols are down in the corner. Now, These two are probably one of my most favorite items from the 1812 collection, just because they are so decorative, absolutely beautiful, with the face carving on the butt of the pistol. So these ones apparently belong to a Henry Garrett, who was a lieutenant of the 41st Regiment. So these were definitely not British issued pieces, probably more personal issues, but they are absolutely beautiful, that you can see there. On the next slide, there we go. So a bit more on some of the weaponry that we have. So we do have tons of cannonballs and tons of musket balls and such, so I didn't really feature those, but what you see here is grape shot that would fit probably in the palm of your hand, like it's not too large. I did show above, so at the bottom corner there's a ball, that's a grape shot, that's one of a few in our collection, and above is an image that shows how the grape shot would have been kind of compiled together. That's actually an image from the collection in Niagara Falls Museum. And these items, this grape shot was kind of compacted together and shot out of a cannon. And what it would do, it would sort of come out and have a raking effect. And so it was very effective against infantry and cavalry forces. There's also in the collection, the two items that look like dumbbells. Those are bar shot. One's American and one is British style. The one in the middle was found at the mouth of the Niagara River. So bar shots were, again, cannon weaponry, and these were used often by the Navy to destroy ship sails. So it would kind of go in and it would rip through a sail to obviously stop the ships from moving around, of course, during that time period. So I wouldn't be true to myself if I didn't include archival items. Unfortunately, archival items never show well. They're better, obviously, for research purposes, but we have a really great archival collection, so I'm going to have to feature a few of them. And I tried to sort of try and break it up a little bit so you guys didn't get too bored. But this piece is really fascinating because it's a broadside that repeals the British Order in Council, which gave the British the authority to seize cargoes of neutral ships and impress seamen of British origin into their navy, which, excuse me, if you're familiar with the War of 1812, impressment and seizing cargo ships was a huge factor in the American Army declaring war. So they declared war on June 18th, 1812, and this broadside of repealing the British Order in Council is actually a response to Napoleon, who revoked the Milan and Berlin decrees, which enforced a blockade on British ships. So a very similar thing. So Napoleon repealed his, and then Britain answered in kind. But unfortunately, this came out too late. It came out in June 23rd, and war was declared by the Americans on June 18th. And word traveled very slowly that day, those days. So of course, it was too late. Perhaps the war would have been delayed or suppressed had there been the magic of internet, and the word would have traveled a lot faster. But unfortunately, it was not. It was too long in coming, and it did not appease the American government anyways. They had grown weary of peaceful coercion and the continued violation of maritime laws and impressment of its citizens. Impressment meaning, of course, forcing their sailors to become British sailors, of course. So that's a really great piece in our collection. This one too is more of a domestic piece, but I really think it's quite telling. It's a sewing sampler dated 1812 that came into our collection before 1911. This is Margaret Stewart's sewing sampler. She was a local girl who was no doubt aware of what was going on around her. We're not sure if this happened earlier in the year or later on in the year. Remember, the war started in June 1812. But it's difficult, like I said, so it's difficult to know when she created it. But the interesting thing in the text there is that it says, "God save the king." And then she writes, "When danger threats the soldier caught and cruel cares assail it, affection's smiles shall soothe his lot or bid him not bewail it." So love of another or a smile from a young female may help rest a soldier's anxiety. Little is known about Miss Stewart, but her age and whether she remained in Niagara. But I would be interested to hear what her parents think of that sewing sampler, of course. So we've got the McCormick Coat. This is a battalion officer's coat, so I didn't get a chance to show this off at the last one. We do have a number of bright coats in our collection. And Captain John McCormick was from the Lincoln Militia, so the local militia here. There's 4 pairs of buttons that adorn the front lapels, which read British Militia and the Royal Cipher of the King George III. He resided in Stamford, which is now part of Niagara Falls, and he fought at the Battle of Queenston Heights during the War of 1812. Some of the uniform features appear to be later than 1812, including the shield-shaped lapels and the domed buttons and the gold lace on the edge of the cuffs, which could mean that McCormick's uniform was probably modified after the war. And this artifact itself has been in the care of the Historical Museum for over a century. So this was one of our early pieces that came in. Oh, sorry, the phone. So this is a muster roll of soldiers belonging to Captain John D. Service, his company of 1st Lincoln Militia Regiment. So the Lincoln Militia was our local militia here, and Service was, you know, they're a local family, very well known, still have descendants here today. And so we have a number of his muster rolls that provide soldiers' names. They provide age, whether they were present or absent during a roll call on December 22nd, 1812. That's the date of this one. This regiment is known to have participated in the Battle of Queenston Heights and Lundy's Lane and the taking of Fort George. And a number of the names that are on the muster roll are very familiar names from our community. Just a little bit about the militia here. Historians often debate the role the militia played in protecting Upper Canada in the War of 1812. There's a militia myth that states that the Canadian militiamen alone saved our country. Certainly, the militia played a significant role in the war. It was, however, the British Army, with the assistance of the militia and First Nations, who preserved Upper Canada. What makes the militia contribution so impressive is that these were regular men going about their daily lives. A lot of them, a majority of them were farmers, probably about 90%. And they were faced with an unusual challenge and were courageous enough to take up arms and defend their homes and their families and their beliefs. And I think that's why Canadians should be really proud of the Lincoln Militia during that time period. This is another, actually, it's a muster roll on the other side, but when you flip it over, there's actually a note from Joseph Clement, who was part of the 1st Lincoln Militia, concerning the guards located between Queenston Camp and Corbin's Inn. So he stated that he visited these men between 2 and 5 p.m. and found them to be present and alert. The interesting thing about it is that it's dated from October 17th, 1812, and that is a couple of days after the Battle of Queenston Heights. So it just happened, and they're still making sure that men are guarding along the river just in case, which is kind of an interesting thought, because Queenston Heights, of course, was the first battle fought in Niagara, and it was quite a significant battle, and Brock had died during that one as well. So this item came into the collection recently, actually in 2019. So this is a new piece. It is a receipt from William Miller for £3, 10 shillings for 2 barrels of flour. And it's signed by 2 men from the Glengarry Light Infantry. What we may not have realized before, and what we know now because of this receipt, is that there was possibly a militia camp in what is now Virgil. So again, this is in 1813. This is just before, this is during the American occupation period. And of course, a lot of people might be familiar with the fact that December 10th is when the American Army burns the town of Niagara. They start to retreat back across the river. So this is just showing that there is presence of the British Army in the Virgil area during just before they kind of continue into town. And the letter is addressed to Camp Crossroads. So Crossroads with the long S there. So again, showing that's Virgil area. This is a $2 Province of Upper Canada Army bill that we have in our collection. It's from 1814. And I just wanted to place it here because we were talking previously about, you know, the flour being purchased for the army and presence of soldiers in Virgil. While the army, the province of Upper Canada Army Bill was, well, first they were issued by the Lower Canadian government, and they issued about 250,000 in dollar denominations, and then later raised that to 1.5 million. And these bills were accepted in both Upper and Lower Canada, and the currency would have been used to pay for troops or to buy provisions during the War of 1812. And following the war, these bills were apparently redeemed in full, but there's no confirmation of that, I think. So yeah, a really neat piece. One of my favorite pieces probably in our collection. This is an engraving of the storming of Fort George from May 27th, 1813. That's the date of the storming of Fort George, of course, not the engraving. So the plate is made in plastic, so it is made later on, and it looks like real copper plate. The engraving is most likely based on one of Harper's Weekly pieces on May 29th, 1858. So really great image of the storming of Fort George. This is William Claus's dispatch case. So William Claus, of course, is a very well-known local family. He was born into a prominent Loyalist family. In 1796, he settled in Niagara-on-the-Lake and became the deputy superintendent of the Indian Department at Fort George. So that means he was responsible for interactions with Six Nations of the Grand River and the British Army. He has a really long and prominent history, which I won't get into because I'm sure that could be a whole lecture on it, in itself, done by a local historian who I know has studied him significantly. But he was appointed to the Legislative Council, and when the War of 1812 broke out, he was a colonel in the 1st Lincoln Militia and the flank commander of the British regulars at Fort George and Queenston Heights. So he did receive this dispatch case during the War of 1812. And I wanted to just kind of tell you an interesting story that I read about Claus, that when the US troops entered Fort George in May of 1813, so when they were taking, the capture of Fort George, they discovered and captured a few soldiers of the 49th, along with Colonel William Claus of the Indian Department, because they were trying to cut down the garrison flag before fleeing. They didn't want the American troops to have the garrison flag. So just interesting, he ended up being captured because of it. During my last talk, I talked about Jacob Ball a bit, and I didn't include these two pieces that we have. They belong to Jacob Ball. So one is the sash, and the other one is an epaulette from a uniform. So he was a captain in the 1st Lincoln Militia during the War of 1812. He shows up on a list of persons ordered into custody by the U.S. Major General Dearborn in June of 1813. This is again during the occupation period. And you may recall from the last talk, what I talked about was his parole paper from May of 1814. So he was eventually captured. And this parole paper includes his age, his height, his complexion, his hair, and his eye color. And the whole thing about the parole paper is that it's essentially a promissory note that says, I won't take up arms against the Americans and fight again. I promise I'll go back to my home. So he was let go, and he didn't actually follow the promise note, of course, because Jacob ended up fighting and dying in the Battle of Lundy's Lane in July of 1814. So he was fighting back against the British not long after he was let go. Again, another thing that I had mentioned during my last talk was about Niagara's first library ledger, which I have a lot of favorites. But again, this is one of my favorite items, of course, because we had the first library in Upper Canada. And you might remember that I had mentioned that there's a gap in the book that exists in 1813 when the town is occupied. But before the gap, there is a signature for a Captain Dorman from a US regiment who paid a 3-month membership to get books out of our local library during the occupation period. So a very, interesting piece. But the part that I wanted to bring up that's new is, because I forgot to include it last time, was that we have an original book from the library, and this book is called The Communicant's Companion. It was published in Glasgow in 1798. This is one of the only known books from the collection of the original Niagara Library that survived the burning of 1813. It is listed as number 81 in the handwritten catalog of the early library holdings. And the booklet reads Niagara Library 1801, and its purchase was for 4 shillings. Only 200 books remained in the library after the burning, but today this is the only one that I know of that is publicly accessible. Another lovely archival piece. You'll see it's really hard to read, but it is correspondence from Amos Shaw, who was part of the militia, to Major Tenbrook, commanding the 4th Regiment of the Lincoln Militia. It's written from the headquarters at 4 Mile Creek. Again, this is the Virgil area, and he's requesting his company rendezvous at the headquarters. This time, this is again at the time of the American occupation of Niagara and Fort George. So, as I mentioned, sort of archival might not display well, but when you're doing research on the War of 1812, things like this can be really integral for researching troop movements and such during the period, and trying to retake Fort George eventually. This is a print that we have in our collection. It's called The Trial of Red Jacket. That was originally painted in 1869 by John Mix Stanley, and the original is held at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Red Jacket was a famous leader of the Seneca tribe of the Iroquois Nation. And in this very ambitious painting, it's a beautiful piece. Mr. Stanley showed the chief defending himself against a charge of witchcraft. Under his white robe, which you can kind of see it here, is a red jacket that was given to him by a British officer for his help as a messenger during the American Revolution. So the Trial of Red Jacket was actually almost destroyed when the Smithsonian Institution had a fire in 1865, but it did survive. And we know from documents in a private collection that Red Jacket was on the US payroll of the Corps of Indian Volunteers during the occupation of Niagara by American forces. And he did end up receiving some pay at Fort George during that 1813 period. So I just wanted to show off that piece and tell you a little bit about Red Jacket. So this is the Dixon sofa table. It's the research that when it came in was that it was saved from the fire of 1813 with the help of natives. It's a mahogany drop leaf sofa table with carved legs and feet from the home of the Honorable William Dixon. There are 4 drawers. There's a couple false drawers in there as well. And so Charlotte, just a story about Charlotte Dixon, who was likely the one who was in the house during that time period, because William Dixon, her husband, who was a very prominent townsman, was actually captured and sent down as a prisoner of war into Albany in the United States. So a little bit about, Charlotte and her family. They owned 2 houses in town. One was on King Street near where the Masonic Hall is today, and the other one was on John Street. And she had hoped on that December day, of course, that her fine house, built only 2 years earlier on land at the edge on the common of John Street, so this is over Randwood area, would escape damage, because she actually had 3 self-invited American house guests living with her. General McClure and Brown and Colonel Seal were the gentlemen who were staying with her. But unfortunately, just like everybody else in the town, she was given only a few hours to evacuate her home and was forced to watch as her brick house. And it's been quoted as, almost the best in the district. That's what her house was described as, was committed to flames. And again, this is one of the items that she managed to save. So we have this piece on display at the museum. This is a china bowl from circa 1810. It's recorded to have belonged to Mrs. Lawrence of Lawrenceville. So some of you might recognize that name because Virgil was once called Lawrenceville, and George, of course, named after George Lawrence. During the Battle of Fort George, this is a bit of a story about Mrs. Lawrence and what happened during her time during the battle of, or the burning, sorry, of Niagara. So actually during the Battle of Fort George, in 1813, many local residents fled the town. A lot of them disappeared. They were experiencing cannon fire from Fort Niagara and from the ships. And Mrs. Lawrence was one of the women who out in Virgil area took on refugees from Old Town area in her home in Virgil. So in fact, we have a few accounts of families who, experiencing the constant bombardment, decided to trek out to Formal Creek. And the Carroll family, for instance, ended up at the Lawrence farm. And as I mentioned, George Lawrence was a farmer out there. He was a Methodist leader. And a number of residents took refuge with the family, so much so that they had approximately 30 sentries, so individuals who were keeping watch to keep the house protected at all times, and at least if they could provide an early warning to those in the home of anyone approaching. Later on, a small party of British soldiers came up to the house, which was very encouraging, at least for a little while, but there were a lot of back and forth skirmishes during that time. So it was a bit nerve-wracking with Americans and British kind of traipsing around the farm. Though they were out of range of Fort Niagara's cannons, the Lawrence farm was still sort of at the mercy of these foraging parties on either side. And there's a story that in one instance, a native party who approached the home, there was a Mrs. Cassidy who was also, taking refuge there with her family. She, one of the native warriors, was going to kill a wounded British soldier who was in the home, kind of taking refuge as well. But this Mrs. Cassidy knocked his tomahawk out of his hand and shouts to him, don't murder the man in my house or in the house, sort of shaming him. So instead, the soldier is actually taken as prisoner, and so is George Lawrence, the homeowner. Soon after, the family and all of the folks who were taking refuge there, Mrs. Lawrence, they end up leaving the home and heading out towards Burlington Heights instead. So that's a really interesting piece. I just wanted to bring up the story of Mrs. Lawrence and a bit of Virgil history there for you folks. This is a receipt acknowledging one of the losses. So as I had mentioned in my last talk, I brought up a lot of war loss claims in the collection. So this time around, I thought I'd include a receipt that was provided to John D. Servos, same Servos that was mentioned before from the Lincoln Militia, acknowledging the payment of his war losses. He actually only got 1/3 of his losses that he claimed. And this is received in May of 1833. So, several years after the war, people are still collecting revenue or funding for their war loss claims, and still not to the same amount of what many of the folks lost. That was either taken or borrowed from either Americans or the British during the War of 1812. Oops, wrong way. There we go. So obviously this image is not an 1812 image, but I wanted to bring up the story of James Cooper for this talk, which is the gentleman sitting there with his wife. So he was born in Scotland in 1770 and arrived in Canada after the Revolutionary War. He married Elizabeth Ixon and raised a large family on their property, which was about midway between Queenston and Niagara, so out in the township area. And James served as a lieutenant in the 2nd Lincoln Militia. And during the Battle of Queenston Heights, James is actually temporarily commanding the Colored Corps, which is a small militia group of African-American men who were fighting with the British. Their captain, known as Captain Runchie, absented himself on the morning of the battle and subsequently resigned from the company. And so James was responsible for leading the charge with this company. And further, when the congregation of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church planned to rebuild their church after it was burned by the Americans, it was actually James Cooper's plan for the rebuild that was chosen. So the building was completed in 1831 and can be described as one of Niagara-on-the-Lake's most beautiful gems. So you can say thank you to James Cooper for the beautiful Presbyterian church that we have here in town. Again, a very interesting piece. This is a letter from January 9th, 1814 from Amos Lee. He was an American prisoner of war who was located in Queenston at a home of a local farmer and former Butler's Ranger, Gilbert Fields. So Amos was writing a letter to Captain Benjamin Carroll, who was in Williamsville, New York, requesting that someone tell his wife where he is and that he is well. He also asked that Carroll help call in some of his debts so that his wife has money while he is stuck in Upper Canada. Unfortunately, we don't know yet what happened to Mr. Lee or his wife, but a really fascinating piece because you don't often hear about a prisoner of war, a letter of that sort. So at least I haven't. During the war, the Fields House was actually used as a barracks for British forces. So it's no surprise that maybe he was stationed here temporarily before he was moved off somewhere else. And considering the date of the document being January 1814, one can wonder if he was captured shortly after the American retreat from Niagara in December, or during the capture of Fort Niagara that happened on the 19th of December following the burning of the town. We don't know how he was captured, but he's here in Niagara in January of 1814. So a really interesting piece. I really like that piece too. So this is the Battle of Lundy's Lane. Sorry, I've got the number there on the side. It's a print of from a steel engraving of the Battle of Lundy's Lane, which happened in July 25th, 1814. And it's based on an original oil on canvas painting by Alonzo Chappelle that was completed in 1859. The Battle of Lundy's Lane is noted as the bloodiest battle of the War of 1812. The Americans failed to dislodge British troops from their positions and were eventually repelled back to Fort Erie. This battle stopped another American advance into Upper Canada. So a pretty significant battle. And that brings me to the Gunder Table. So this is a kitchen or a dining room table. It's an early 18th century provincial style, similar to German communities in Pennsylvania. And the table is featured in a lot of early Upper Canadian furniture books and is often picked out as one of the oldest tables to be included in those books. It was either brought to Niagara from Pennsylvania by Loyalist patriarch Michael Gunder or built shortly after their arrival. It's thought that Michael Gunder left the Pennsylvania about 1788 after the Revolutionary War because he was being persecuted for his loyalist mindset and his support of the British Army. And so he came to Niagara. His wife was left in the States. She didn't agree with leaving the States. She didn't want to come up to Canada. So he took 2 of his children and left the others with their mother and came up to live in Niagara briefly and then located near Black Creek. Which is, Niagara Falls sort of area. But Michael was known for hosting many new immigrants in his home or British soldiers in his home. And during the War of 1812, their home is said to have been a command post for Sir Gordon Drummond during the siege of Fort Erie. That's after the troops were repelled from the Lundy's Lane battle that I mentioned previously. And this table was used by him during that time. Drummond was the president of the government and was commander of the troops in Upper Canada. So he was someone who came up after, would have been in the same position essentially of what you would know of Brock if you aren't familiar with Drummond and with his name. Sorry, I've got the number there. I didn't put the title there, but this is a true copy of a manuscript of a general order from Drummond thanking troops and militia for their gallantry and such during the Battle of Queenston Heights or Battle of Lundy's Lane. He offers particular administration. He like names people for what they did during that time. He mentions the militias, those who were wounded, those who were killed and such. So a really beautiful, really interesting document, just kind of being sincere and warm about, the troops' efforts during that time. And it was possibly written, who knows, on the table that we showed previously. Again, another great archival item, this letter from John Clark at Fort George to Major Jacob Tenbrook of the 4th Regiment of the Lincoln Militia in Grantham discusses the shortage of men at Fort George. So in this letter, Clark actually reports that when Captain Nels's company of the 4th Lincoln was called out for active service at Fort George, he showed up with only 7 men, claiming that the remainder of his company were cutting timber for the government elsewhere. Clark was so upset by this when he expected a full company of about 50 men to report for duty at Fort George, and in effect, he threatened Major Tenbrook. He said it was important, to have the militia work on the fortifications of Fort George and Fort Mississauga, which was under construction, and getting these places into defensible shape was crucial at the time, as was proven in July when the Americans invaded yet again and marched to the town of Niagara following their victory at the Battle of Chippewa. The forts were sufficiently strong to prevent the Americans from attacking and recapturing Niagara, but Clark writes that in future, 2 companies will be required to serve for 7 days. And then he stated that if more men did not readily respond when called out for duty, then we will call for the whole regiment and keep them out until the service required is performed. This is sort of a goading, undoubtedly, to spur Tenbrook to ensure that he had sufficient volunteers answering the call when required, because, if he was to call the whole regiment, that would be every man from the ages of 16 to 60 being forced to serve. And obviously a number of the militiamen were probably back home, possibly, working on their farms and such. So it would be quite frustrating, of course, to bring out the entire regiment. So a really fascinating piece, kind of a bitter piece. Of course, Clark is quite bitter with Tenbrook there. So Brock's monument and commemoration is obviously a very important part of the War of 1812, and Brock's monument is probably one of the most prominent architectural pieces in our community. And so I wanted to talk about that because we obviously have a ton of imagery of this beautiful monument. So I wanted to bring it up. So in a letter to his next of kin, one of General Brock's aide-de-camps, Captain John B. Glegg, recounted that the fallen hero's body was carried from the field to a nearby house in Queenston, where it was concealed for the rest of the battle. Brock's body later was taken back to the town of Niagara, where he lay and stayed at the government house at Queen and King, which is the block where the courthouse is today. And on October 16th, he was honored with a prominent funeral procession and was buried in one of the bastions at Fort George. The Americans at Fort Niagara fired a cannon salute, blank charges, to honor Brock and his aide-de-camp, Macdonell, who was also killed during the battle. And so a massive 40-meter Tuscan monument to Brock was erected by the province of Upper Canada in 1824. And both Brock and Macdonell were reinterred under that monument. But unfortunately, a massive blast in 1840 set off by an Irish-Canadian terrorist, Benjamin Lett, which, if you're interested in Benjamin Lett, we have an audio clip that Ron Dale did of talking about Benjamin Lett, who, interestingly enough, is a relative of his. So you can learn more about him on our YouTube there. So he heavily damaged the monument, which was then replaced by an impressive 56-meter monument completed in 1856. So that's the monument that you see today. So the images that you see here, the first one on the left is the monument that you know today. The next one is a print that was done of after the damage had been done, to sort of show what the significance of the damage was. And then the text document is actually draft text that was written for a small monument that was placed near the spot where Brock died. The early text, as you can see, was very long and descriptive. It was about 8, very descriptive lines. And then it ended up only being one quick line stating, near this spot, Major General Sir Isaac Brock, Provincial Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, fell 13th of October 1812 while advancing to repel the invading enemy. But anyone reading that textual documents will just kind of giggle because it's very flowery and long and such. And then how funny now that it's just the one line that's there. And then again, there's another print of the original Brock monument after its before its destruction there. So I'm just gonna go to the next one because it's still some Brock Monument stuff here. So another item that we had is the newsprint piece down at the bottom there, and it's printed by William Lloyd Mackenzie, which is the printer in Queenston, the proposed arrangements of the reburying of Major General Brock, his body under the first monument, so in 1824, which included those involved in the parade, about a 19-gun salute, what route they took. And if any historians who are on here have studied 1812 history, thought that John McDonnell, Brock's aide-de-camp, has been nothing but forgotten in all of Brock's celebrations. I mean, he is buried under the monument, but a lot of people don't know that as well. But in this newsprint notice, he's located in the parade after Brock, who is noted as the body. And they talk about Brock being, the body, and it's very prominent. And then McDonnell follows with a reference as, the ABC to the late Major General Sir Isaac Brock. So he's just kind of like, the guy that follows after Brock. So he really doesn't get, the poor guy, McDonnell, will, I feel like, forever be in Brock's shadow and forgotten. Other items in our collection include, we've got the minutes of the meetings of the committee that were appointed for the reconstruction after it was blown up. We have letters from the architect, William Thomas, to Sir Allan McNabb, who was a committee member from the 1860s. Thomas wrote that he had eyewitness accounts of where Brock fell and, marking that site and such. So really interesting collection, just a bit on Brock's monument there. And a bit more on commemorating. So as I mentioned, it was very important for commemoration to happen in 1912. And even before that, a number of veterans would meet annually in October to commemorate Brock and to honor him and to honor what they went through together. So this is an image in our collection from 1871 that shows 21 men standing, posing for a group photo in front of Brock's monument at Queenston Heights. The grass is tall. You can see there's, little trees in the background, and there's a lot of local names who are listed there. And the veterans are accompanied by their sons and other relatives, of course, and young children who are present. So they're bringing them in to remember Brock and the War of 1812. And finally, of course, a very important piece in our collection, of course, is the War of 1812 Bicentennial Archives. So I know some of you are probably chuckling because it just happened not too long ago, but the museum does like to do some proactive collecting. And we did collect a number of stuff from the bicentennial that happened here in 2012, 2013, 14, and such, because of course this collection will be of interest in another 100 years, perhaps when they are celebrating and remembering the War of 1812. So we do have the War of 1812 current bicentennial archives in our collection. And that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you found some things of interest. And I know I went pretty quickly through it, a lot of archives items, but it really is an amazing collection. So I really appreciate your interest in it. I hope I didn't bore you too much. And perhaps there's another collection I can feature next time rather than 1812 items. But I guess, Shauna, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. I'll stop sharing too.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. Judy would like to know what was the purpose of the gorget?
So that was really more at this time a decorative piece, and it kind of showed a bit of rank that you were someone more of rank. But like I said, it's sort of a symbol of, back in the day when they used to wear full armor, the troops used to wear more full armor. This was sort of kind of a lingering piece for that, but it was really to show rank. So it was just a small piece that hung around your neck at that spot there. Yeah.
Excellent. And John Davis says that there's information about some of the small engagements in Crossroads in John Norton's journal.
That's right. Yeah, it's a great resource for anyone who's interested. I mean, the John Norton Journal is interesting anyways, but a lot of tidbits that people can find about the War of 1812 in there. Thank you very much, John.
And that's all I've got, unless anyone has anything else. It seems like, you hit all the notes there with the docket.
I'm not sure about that, but thank you everyone for coming. Oh, is there another one?
Thank you. Emily Hyde says, thank you for the info about Brock's monument. I have never seen photos of the original monument, so thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, you might be able to find some more stuff up online. We're trying to get a lot of our collection up online, so feel free to look through our website for the online collection to see if you can find some more imagery.
Excellent. And I have another question coming in. Bruce would like to know how many of the military items like crossbelt plates have any provenance back to the British soldiers?
If you're talking about individuals, we don't have them tied. None of the crossbelt plates, I think, are tied to an actual individual. They've just come in generally, and we knew that that regiment fought in Niagara, perhaps, so that, that's why we've taken it into our collection.
Excellent. Well, that's all we've got today for questions. So thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing our War of 1812 collection. I know 1812 is certainly not my specialty, and I love learning, about our collection, and you're very knowledgeable on the collection as well from your various travels throughout the Niagara museums, digitizing everyone's stuff. So thank you so much for sharing with us your experience there. And just reminder, our next lecture is on Wednesday, December 15th at 10 a.m. And Rochelle Bush will be with us, and she's presenting The Lesser Known, Uncovering Some of the Black People of Old Niagara and the Surrounding Area. Don't forget to register. The link can be found on the events calendar on our website, which is notlmuseum.ca. Thank you everyone for joining us. Oh, and have a good rest of your day. And Bruce Parker says, again, excellent presentation. Archival documents were very interesting.
They're my favorite, Bruce, so I'm glad you like them too.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.